Hello and welcome to today's lesson, which is on No Problem by Benjamin Zephaniah. Now, the first thing we're going to do, as ever, is look at the context behind the poet. So, Benjamin Zephaniah was born in Birmingham to parents from Barbados and Jamaica. So, Birmingham at the time had a high number of Jamaican immigrants and was famous for that. Zephaniah and his family experienced a great deal of racism growing up. So he performed poetry at a young age in churches in his neighbourhood. When he was 22, he moved to London to expand his audience beyond just purely the kind of black churches of his neighbourhood. He's extremely political and has campaigned on issues such as changing parliament, getting rid of royalty, and anti-homophobia. So he is a dub poet, so these are political poems which are often set to political music. So this poem that we're going to read today, you can kind of imagine it set to a beat. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to read through the poem before analysing it in line by line detail. I am not the problem, but I bear the brunt of the silly playground taunts and racist stunts. I am not the problem. I am born academic, but they got me on the run. Now I'm a branded athletic. I am not the problem. If you give I a chance, I can teach you a Timbuktu. I can do more than dance. I am not the problem. I greet you with a smile. You put me in a pigeonhole, but I am versatile. These conditions may affect me as I get older, and I am positively sure I have no chips on my shoulders. Black is not the problem. Mother country get it right, and just for the record, some of my best friends are white. Okay, so let's look at the first line. He says, I am not the problem. So immediately he's sort of on the defensive here, and he's suggesting that he isn't the problem. But immediately we're slightly unsure, without hearing the context of the rest of the poem, who's accusing him of being a problem. But obviously, as we dig into the detail of the rest of the poem, it becomes clear that this is from a racial perspective. He says, I'm not the problem. And immediately we've got evidence of a dialect. D, obviously, the problem, but because he's of a Jamaican heritage, there's that dialect to represent the way a Jamaican person would say that sentence. And this immediately we can compare this with half caste. So carrying on with this dialect, we have the second line, but I bear the brunt. So he's talking about he carries the brunt of being of a certain race, obviously being black in this mostly white environment that he's growing up in. He carries the burden for that, and he's almost viewed as representative of all black people, and he carries this burden. So he bears the brunt of silly playground taunts. So he's talking about racism and really saying that when you experience racism, it's something that starts at a very early age. It's with you as soon as you go to primary school and secondary school, you carry this stigma around with you, and you'll always attract certain playground taunts, certain nastiness. And we also, he goes on to say, racist stunts. So it starts out fairly light-hearted, where he talks about playground taunts. So obviously, this is not pleasant behaviour, but then it gets a little bit deeper when he talks about overt racist stunts. He is the victim of racism, and he makes this very clear. So this refrain or anaphora, I am not the problem. He's saying, just because I'm black, just because I'm a different racial makeup than you, I'm not the problem. Obviously, you are the problem. If you are going to label people and insult them because they're of a different race, you are the problem, not me. He was born academic, and obviously Zephaniah is a poet. He's very politically engaged and extremely intelligent man, and he was born academic. He was very academic at school. However, while at school, because he was black, people assumed he was good at certain sports when actually he had no interest in those sports. He said, but they got me on the run. So they assume that because he's black, he's quick. And this is a racial stereotype of black people, that some people believe that black people um, are naturally or biologically quicker than white people. So there's this stereotype that's emerged. Now I'm branded athletic. So purely um, as a result of his race, he's considered athletic. Now, you might be reading this and listening to this and thinking, well, surely there are worse things to be categorized with or stereotyped as being sporty and being quick, which is true. However, I think Zephaniah's point is the minute you pigeonhole people or label them because of a certain race, you actually deny them having an individual identity. And that's the serious point here that we'll come back to. He repeats this anaphora, I am not a problem. If you give I a chance, I can teach you of Timbuktu. So again, the use of English there very much reflecting that he's using a dialect to represent his Jamaican heritage. He mentions Timbuktu, which is a place in Mali in Africa. And he uses the word teach, and he's really questioning the white British syllabus here in history. The fact that if you are, and you will know this, if you're a GCSE student listening to this, or even a school student, you will know that at school you will learn about Henry VIII and his wives, and you'll learn about World War II, perhaps even the French and Russian revolutions, but you probably won't learn about Timbuktu in Africa. So he's questioning the white Eurocentric syllabus here. He's saying, well, actually, I can teach of Timbuktu. I think it's worth knowing about. You're probably not going to learn it in school because they're going to focus on white history. So carrying on with this idea of stereotypes, he says, I can do more than dance. So again, as a black person, he is being stereotyped as someone who's going to be good at dancing. So again, like being accused of being good at running, although it's not an awful accusation, it is part of a more serious issue. The idea that if you label someone because of their race, you are denying them an individual identity and you're just labeling them as one group, and that in itself is racist. Even though it could be argued that saying someone's good at dancing because they're black is not incredibly serious, it is part of that wider issue of stereotyping. So that anaphora is back. I am not the problem. He says, I greet you with a smile, you put me in a pigeonhole. So I greet you with a smile. He's welcoming and friendly towards people of other races. However, he himself is being placed in a pigeonhole. What does this phrase mean? Pigeonhole? Well, pigeonhole is when you label someone within a narrow category and you don't really allow them to be anything other than a small number of cliches. So if you're black, you are sporty, you are good at running, you are a good dancer, you are not necessarily academic. Now, for someone like Benjamin Zephaniah, that's a huge issue because as a child, he was very good at school, very academic, but perhaps he was held back because he was black and people thought, oh, well, no, you're this, you're this label, and that's really problematic. So he shrugs this off by saying, I am versatile. So he makes a little bit of a joke of it. He's saying, you can try and trap me, you can try and label me within very narrow parameters. However, I'm versatile and I'm going to get out of that pigeonhole and prove that I'm not just a list of cliches and stereotypes. So it gets a little bit more serious here when he says these conditions may affect me as I get older. So what he's saying there really is, actually, although it starts off with playground taunts, this could have a serious impact in later life, suggesting that perhaps he won't be afforded the same job opportunities possibly as white people because of his race. He will be otherwise held back in his life. And you may have heard of the idea of white privilege, the idea that if you are white, that you carry with you certain privileges, and that you possibly are going to have an easier time at things in terms of job applications, and you're less likely to face stereotyping and racism. So he says, I'm positively sure I have no chips on my shoulders. So what does it mean? You may have heard this phrase, chip on your shoulder. So if you have a chip on your shoulder, you're always moaning about your treatment. You're always moaning about how the world has treated you and how everything's not fair. But he said, no, I don't live with that. I'm kind of accepting, look, I'm a black person growing up in Britain. Unfortunately, I have to live with these stereotypes. I'm not going to spend my life being a victim. And he's saying, you've got to approach race positively. I'm not gonna. I don't expect any sympathy. He's just clearly laying out his position here. And we've had this anaphora throughout the poem where he says, I am not a problem, I am not a problem, I am not a problem. But now he's saying black is not a problem. And he's being very overt here with his racial and political point, where he's saying black people are not the issue here. The issue is racism. The issue is people stereotyping. And he's really spelling out his argument extremely clearly here when he says black is not a problem. Okay, so the next line, mother country, get it right. What is the mother country? I think there are several interpretations of this. One, that it could be Africa, then or another country where, like the West Indies, or an area rather, or a country like Jamaica. Mother country could be the country where your heritage is from. So when people talk about your mother country, if you are perhaps a black person living in Britain, you might view your mother country as an African country. But the other idea could be that mother country is Britain, and actually when it had an empire, it was the mother country, and almost all other countries were in the control of Britain. And obviously from Zephaniah's point of view, Britain was not a good imperial master and was actually a very cruel imperial master. And actually Jamaica was one of those countries that was under the British Empire and the British rule. And that's why there was so many Jamaican immigrants, because in order to gain higher numbers for their workforce in Britain, Britain opened their borders to immigrants from former colonies like Jamaica. This very clever ending of the poem, he says, and just for the record, some of me best friends are white. So he refers to that old cliched defense where if you're about to make a racist comment, or after you've made a racist comment, you kind of mitigate it or justify it by saying, I'm not racist, some of my best friends are black. As if to say, I couldn't possibly say anything racist or worthy of condemnation because I have black friends. And he turns this on his head and says some of my best friends are white. So he's almost having a subtle dig at those racist people who are perhaps not openly racist in the way they're not wearing a Ku Klux Klan hood, they're not joining right-wing organisations, but they are subtly racist in their behaviour and outlook, and use mitigating phrases such as some of my best friends are black. So he's poking fun at those people. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the form and structure of the poem. So remember, the form refers to the shape, size, and number of stanzas in a poem. So the poem is divided into two stanzas. Now, the first stanza deals with the frustration involved with negative stereotypes, or he talks about playground taunts and having to bear the brunt of racist stunts. And he also talks about being labelled as athletic when actually he wanted to be known for his academic prowess. So the second stanza is about standing up to these stereotypes, and it's not always a really angry poem. He actually uses humour to deflect some of these stereotypes, particularly that final line that we've just gone through. Okay, so let's have a look at the structure of the poem. So when we talk about structure, we're talking about the rhyme scheme and the meter in a poem. So the poem follows roughly A, B, C, B, D, F, E. So almost rhyming couplets, but not quite. So the structure, I think, gives the poem some sense of unity while also giving the poem freedom to express his views on the subject without being overly constrained. So Benjamin Zephaniah actually identifies as a bit of an anarchist politically. So it kind of makes sense that his poetry is not overly restrained by strict, um, really, really rigid structure, and he allows there to be flexibility in his structure, and that also connects with the idea of it being a dub um, poet, because dub poets are very political, would like to rebel against the status quo. So again, it makes sense that the structure and indeed the form of the poem is not hampered or restrained by really archaic traditional structures and forms of poems. Okay, hopefully you found this video helpful. If you would like to look at other poems in the Edexcel Conflict series, please check out the rest of my YouTube channel. As ever, thanks for listening.